Okay, welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you here. So, this conversation that we're about to begin is one in our Educated Activist series. Educated Activists is our Minyan Tzedek, our justice team's effort to keep our community educated and engaged and informed about the policy issues and the complex problems that we try to address together through our community organizing work, through our green action work, through our global partnership work. Our Educated Activist team, sitting right here in the front row, Sifra Nemeth and Anita Sigmund, are leaders in thinking about how we do this work together, the things we want to learn. If you're somebody who's interested in being a part of that team, please let me know afterwards. We'd love to have more people as part of our process in doing that work. So thank you to Anita and Sifra for your leadership in that effort. Thank you to our community organizing leadership, many of whom are here today, and to our Green Action leadership, who are also here today too. We really are grateful for the incredible lay leaders that we have in this community who help us do this work together. So with that, I want to introduce myself. I'm Brooke Wertschafter, the Director of Community Organizing here at ECAR. I'm happy to be here with all of you. And I want to introduce our guest for today. This is Conor Dougherty. Conor is clap it up. Conor is, as of course you know, a journalist with the New York Times. Whoops, and I'm on the wrong page, so I have to get to my bio page here. So Conor is an economics and housing reporter at the New York Times. Conor recently moved to LA from San Francisco, and we're going to talk about that. But over a 2-decade career, he's covered a range of topics, including banking, entertainment, and sports, but mostly he's focused on economics and housing. In 2017, his Cramped and Costly series won the Deadline Club Award for beat reporting. And based on the stories from that reporting, those stories inspired his first book, Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America, which was reported over a 3-year period from 2015 to 2018 and was published in 2020. So much of the conversation we're going to have today is based on Conor's work for that book, Golden Gates, which I highly encourage you to read. If you haven't had a chance yet, it's really an excellent book. Some folks here are waving it around. I want to, for those who haven't had a chance to read the book, I want to pick two short snippets of reviews to give you a little bit of a deeper sense of what the book is about before we launch in together. So Conor, I hope you won't be too embarrassed while I read these glowing reviews of your book. So, Brandon Fuller from the Wall Street Journal says, for a compelling and accessible overview of California's housing crisis, there's no better book than Conor Dougherty's Golden Gates. Mr. Dougherty has a gift for telling the stories of people struggling to overcome California's housing dysfunction. The teenager fighting a rent increase that would displace her family, the 3 brothers who share one room in a house that is already home to 7 other people, the enterprising builder who assumes massive regulatory risk to experiment with modular housing, the Catholic nun who tangles with real estate investors to buy up apartment buildings and deed restrict them as forever affordable. Absorbed in these narratives, the reader hardly realizes he is receiving an education on the political economy of California's housing market. And then from Richard Rothstein, many of you will remember Richard Rothstein as the author of The Color of Law. Richard Rothstein said that Golden Gates focuses on California, but has lessons for all metropolitan areas. Smugly deeming itself racially progressive, the state allows high-wage employment, mostly for whites and educated immigrants, to grow faster than housing supply, ensuring that priced-out Black and Hispanic families will suffer greater homelessness and displacement to job-starved, distant suburbs. Segregation increases as voters enact local zoning codes to prevent new home building, but those in desperate need of housing can't register to vote in the no-growth towns that ban them. That's structural racism. So Conor, thank you so much, first of all, for being here today. We're so grateful to have you join us.
Thanks for reminding me that those things were written.
People said nice things about your book,
and
they're still saying nice things about your book. And that's what we're doing here today. So Conor, as a journalist, you tell stories that help your readers understand what can feel like abstract economic issues. Your book and much of your recent reporting have focused particularly on California's housing shortage and what it is doing to real people. What is the narrative of housing in California?
Okay, let me just start by saying thank you for having me. I'll just make one side note, which is that in all the work I've done in various places around the country, some of the most interesting and impactful work has been faith communities. I think one of my first stories was about one of my first stories in sort of the like recent past 8 years. I've covered housing longer than that, but this kind of current moment, crisis, whatever we want to call it, we're in, began with a rent control drive, but it was really driven by Faith in Action, which I'm sure you work with, but this was in Northern California. Anyway, all across the country, I see that nun, Sister Christina, this common thread. So good on you. It's noticeable in many places. I guess the story of California is to some extent, over whatever it is, 75-ish years, the place that everybody wanted to be in was seen as a projection of a life with more abundance and more material, more broadly distributed material comfort, for lack of a better term, more leisure, less work, more for your work. I don't know how to describe what a broad middle class looks like, but I think when we sort of try to atomize what people are looking for, they're looking for weekends when they can do things, feeling like their job covers a life that they deem acceptable and sort of on par with what many of their neighbors have. And so it feels like California was at one point a projection of that being very broadly shared. There was an article in Life magazine, the now defunct Life magazine, in, I believe, 1945. I reference it in the book, but it was right at the end of World War II. So I believe it was 45, maybe it was 46. But anyway, and they picked 3 families in Los Angeles, of all places. And one family is, I believe, a composer for film studios. And he made roughly the equivalent of like $700,000 a year. Then they had like a salesperson who made, let's say, 150 grand a year. And then they had Leroy Loeffler, who I remember so very well, who was, I believe, a fireman in Glendale, a fire person in Glendale. And the Loeffler family, the article went out, the 12-page full of ads, different era in many other ways, article went out of its way to sort of say and sort of note the ways in which the $40,000, again, it was like $5,000 or something, but the inflation adjusted 40,000, the family's life was not that much different from the 150,000 Westwood family. And this was an article that Life, by its own sort of setup, was saying this is projecting what life is going to be like after World War II. That this thing that's happening in California and the degree to which this fireman and this $150,000 a year earning salesperson, that their lives are not that much different. That's what we're headed towards. So that was like seen as a national symbol, and it was defined by how broadly it was, not just how 1 or 2 people lived. And now, of course, California is this story of the worst homeless problem in the country and some of the worst housing burdens and overcrowding, and just everything with housing is now seen as worse here. So I guess to some extent, that's the story. It's maybe worth remembering that we were at one point the national symbol of the good story. And I don't know that we'll get back to that precise vision in exactly the same way. But it is worth remembering that at one point we were the vision of a broadly shared housing affluence.
Thank you. So we just released a podcast, which we called Home, with members of our own community telling their stories about their experiences with housing insecurity. And I think for many of us, it was eye-opening to hear from members of our own community who ran the gamut from personally experiencing houselessness themselves to struggling to afford a home, even though they earned a decent salary, to going from being comfortably housed to being very insecurely housed because of a relationship breakup or a disability. And so we in our own community are experiencing that and feeling those stories ourselves. I wonder what you think the story that you just told says about us as a society.
Yeah, I mean, it does not say nice things, clearly. And I think people feel that, but they don't know what to do about it. Because everybody I know, when they, particularly with homelessness, feels very bad. And I don't mean bad like they're disturbed in some way by their own inconvenience, though that happens, but they just see this problem that feels so wrong to them, and they have very little sense of how they can make any impact on it. I mean, you can of course buy someone a meal or any of these things, but that feeling of powerlessness, I think that's how people experience it. I guess I would say that it says that we're a more, without judging it, we're a more private society now. That's something you guys maybe aren't, but meaning you have this community. I'm sure everyone has their own privacy. I didn't mean it like that. It's not a hippie enclave or whatever. But what I mean is that maybe it is. I'm just saying. It doesn't have to be for people to have a community. People are more, people's private lives are more, people's struggles are more hidden, it feels like now. I don't know, maybe I always get a little reluctant to draw comparisons to things that happened like before I was born, but we do know that people have less bonds now. The sort of safety net of community, whether that's family or extended family, is certainly, that sort of social safety net is much, has bigger holes in it now. So that's one thing we know. We are more unequal. We know that. The unequal part is not in and of itself bad. I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but what I'm saying is the real problem is that people at the middle level cannot afford a life that is anywhere near what it used to be. So, and I guess another thing it shows us, and this is what I think is the problem writ large with all of our politics right now, is there's a sense that we're going backwards. I mean, even Make America Great Again, which, let's just strip away any connotation with that, it is a backwards looking statement. And I think one of the reasons it's effective is that there is a sense, a real sense, a not made up sense, that there used to be, that many of your sort of more basic needs, a house, whatever, used to be easier to get. And so I think that's another thing it says about us. I mean, I could say, oh, we're vicious and we're horrible and we don't care about each other. But I mean, I want to try to think about what things we can isolate and sort of say, what have we learned? I really do think the kind of, we don't have a social, we don't have social bonds anymore that hold us together the same way. I actually think there's like this book, Bowling Alone. I think that thing is real.
So far we've been talking about this without really explicitly talking about race and racism and how it shapes the story of housing in California and in the state and the situation we're in now. So I just want to ask you to say more explicitly how you see race and racism shaping the situation that we're in now, and even the social atomization that you're talking about.
Yeah, so this is very important. Very important. It's also a hard one to address sometimes. but I'll explain that. As of before 1948, you could, and everybody did, explicitly say there can be nobody except for white people, or I'm sure they discriminated by religion as well, in this development. And as many of you have probably discovered, and if you haven't, you can easily discover, these are still attached to deeds of homes throughout this state. There was like a law to get rid of it once, and I don't know, it's deemed too complicated. But nevertheless, much the way somebody, I mean, it was very ordinary. If you could look up these deeds, they're quite shocking. Much the way that somebody would now in, Irvine or someplace, or parts of LA, but I always think of Irvine, be like, you must mow your lawn, or you can't put a billboard on your roof. It would like literally list no billboard on your roof. Apparently there was a time when you really had to say this to people, because I remember it said like, no black people, no billboards, no, you're like, it's quite shocking. So, and that's how ordinary it was. Oh, well, you can't have a billboard on your roof, and you can't, it's that ordinary. So after 1948, that was not allowed. And of course, people found ways to do it instead with the FHA mortgage lending guidelines. And what is most enraging about that is that in a way it was almost worse than that uglier 1948 thing, because this was the federal government basically conceiving a program in which they were going to give lower cost loans, in essence, free money, to one group of people while explicitly denying it to another. So we talk about reparations now. I mean, we really had like kind of white reparations where they create a program, as anybody knows, as anybody who has a 30-year fixed mortgage, which is most people, knows, it's really nice to have a fixed cost payment. It's not something that you have in a lot of other countries. Requires a lot of government work to do that. So they created this whole giant program basically to give, in effect, free money to one group of people and not another. If you read The Color of Law, which it sounds like some of you have, it's actually what I loved about that book, beyond all the stuff you learn, is it's almost like structured as like a court case in a way. And I thought that was like a really interesting, I think that helped frame the issue in a way, like, wow, our own government did this thing. So that's about as insidious as it gets. And it's that most wealth in America is property wealth. So clearly that one decision can explain, that one government policy can explain at least half, probably more, of our wealth gap. So it's hard to understate the effect of that. When I said it's hard, what I meant was, when you start talking about how to go forward from there, when you start saying, what solutions are we going, okay, that's, that happened and it was horrible, and we can take moments to think about that, but what are we going to do to move forward? It's not quite as simple as saying, oh, I guess what I'm saying is like, people start talking about building more housing, and they start talking about changing suburbs. But of course, enough things have changed between then and now that you find the alliances and the fights are not as, what I mean by that is, you see all sorts of suburban homeowners like teaming up with anti-gentrification advocates for similar policy. It just becomes very difficult to sort of think through how you can develop real workable things that will start to address this stuff, other than just a more broad shared prosperity. I mean, I think we should have I think I think people should discuss those things. They're all important, you know what I mean? But I'm just saying, when you actually start thinking through how you're going to how you're going to do them in a way that would be real and on the scale of what we just described, it gets very difficult. And if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is that it's all well and good to talk about these things, but when you actually start going like, what are we really going to do? Like, how do we start addressing these things? I think things like free college or very like if the UC system was like how it used to be, where it was like pretty broadly open and much cheaper, I think that would be like a really good thing. I don't know that we, does that make sense?
Yes.
Like, yeah.
So I just want to respond and say, ECAR has made a commitment to support the idea of reparations. And in fact, we hope to be hosting an event within the next few months with some of our partners, learning about the state's, the state has a panel that the legislature impaneled to look at ideas for how to carry out reparations. And it's something we're going to be thinking about. And, you know, you may not feel like you're in a place where you can sort of endorse reparations.
No, I didn't mean
that.
it's
It's
more the journalistic thing.
Yes.
And I'm not, I mean, I'm not embarrassed to say like, if you, I don't think it's hurting my objectivity to say like, here's a government policy that explicitly does. What I'm trying to sort of get in the spirit of is saying what sorts of things have that kind of scale. And those kinds of, it feels to me like those are just going to be broader. Those are going to be things that apply to, they're not going to be racially based. Like if we just did, we have a commitment to make the UC school, the UC system as inexpensive as it used to be and have tons of, and for it to be for all Californians, for all zip codes. And we like, I think that would be a great thing. And it would inevitably move in the direction of what we're talking about.
Yeah. So, and I want to go back and pick up a thread that I think you mentioned just now, which is the shifting alliances and the complicated alliances that have been created by the system that we have now had in place for the last 2 or 3 generations. And one of the things I think you pointed to is that the system that we have had made housing the primary tool for generating wealth and passing on wealth from one generation to another especially for white Americans who got the opportunity to jump on the ladder at the end of World War II and participate in that free government money you were talking about. And so, but interestingly, other people have jumped onto that ladder in different ways and completely unequally. And that has in some ways complicated the picture. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what it means for us to have made housing a primary tool for both generating wealth and passing on wealth from one generation to the next, and how that shapes both our housing landscape and our housing opportunities, let's call it that.
So let me think about this. There's 2 ways of looking at this. As this congregation surely knows, and as all congregations surely know, fights over land are about as old as people, and they animate great whacks of the Bible or the Tanakh or whichever version you're reading, whichever half you're partial to. And there probably has not been a war that wasn't primarily about some sort of land. At least it's got to cover most of them. And so how people sort of allocate space and ascribe value to that is kind of all of civilization is somehow ordered around that. So it's worth taking that as a baseline. I think that and I think that people having value in a home or the home being in a good neighborhood, or I think all those things we should probably just accept them. What I think has become a huge problem is we've allowed the value of specifically placating homeowners with scarcity, meaning that we have told people, I will protect your property values, which is a means of saying, I am going to try and prop up your asset value by reducing competition, in effect. I think that thinking about it that way is pretty poisonous because it is inevitably going to crowd out the next generation of home buyers or and just families trying to get ahead. So I do think that I guess this is a very long way of saying it doesn't bother me that home values go up. It just bothers me that they go up as much as they do. And that buying or living in a home has become essentially unattainable for large amounts of people. That's a little bit of a mealy-mouthed answer, but I guess the reason it's mealy-mouthed is that I try not to be too, especially now that I own a home, thankfully, our structure, there's a lot of things we've done to make home ownership like better than renting, financially, stability, whatever. And I think it's worth bending that in the direction of renters, making, if you go to Germany and places like that, I mean, being a renter is just like a completely different experience. But I don't want to just throw away this idea of home ownership or housing as a store of value, because it does feel like you're starting to mess with things that are bigger than things that are sort of inherent to humanity.
So you moved to LA just
Mhm.
recently within the last year. And I'm curious if you would share with us a little bit about what you were looking for in a home for yourself and your family. You have young kids.
Yes. Well, I should say, with a little bit of, or a lot of blushing, we basically won the lottery in Oakland. We bought this house and thought that it was the worst financial decision we could ever make, but that we would be there for more than 10 years. It turned out that was not the case. The house did better, and then it exploded in COVID, and then we thankfully sold it right before interest rates went up. Thank you to HBO Max for hiring my wife on the schedule that they did, because that determined when we said we didn't time anything other than, oh, we got to move on this date. Anyhow, I was looking for, I say that only to say I recognize I was very lucky, and these forces over which I had no control and no particular ingenuity attached to have smiled on me. And I'm not going to apologize for that, but it bothers me that that's the only way I could get in. Does that make sense? Okay. So we bought a house in Studio City, and the reason we did that was we wanted a place that was close enough to Eagle Rock, where my mother-in-law lives, so close to family. That's a pretty universal thing, but close to I guess my and my wife's work. If I ever go back to the office, the office I've been to twice is right over there, right across from LACMA. Or the Academy Museum now. Yes, I'm accustomed to only thinking of it as LACMA, but now there's other things. And then we wanted a good school. And we wanted a good school that we didn't have to do like 5,000 hours of research to find. And so finding a school that was, for lack of a better term, plug and play, that we were going to move on a short schedule. And I guess the thing that I think is universal about that is, independent of your moving status, the idea that you can just go to the neighborhood school and that's like fine. I think that's, I just think about how much waste there is in people like totally trying to figure out the exact best school. I mean, just the amount of hours people put into that now.
And the commuting that kids now do to get across town. Yeah,
feels like a little crazy. And as a product of state schools, and public schools, I feel, and my parents never felt like I was at some particular disadvantage. And it seemed to work out. I think that those three things, being close to family, being close to work, and having a good school, I think those are pretty universal. And that's really hard to find now. I mean, again, we could have a whole 15 minutes half an hour, 40 minutes, I mean, again, I don't want to like put all these things in amber. People do make decisions about their own. Some people want a much bigger house, like further out, and they're perfectly willing with making that trade-off. And other people, I'm all for that variability. I just think we've gotten to a place where just finding those few things is like really hard.
So thank you for sharing that personal reflection. So in your book, one of the stories you tell is about the birth of the YIMBY movement in the Bay Area, both from the outside activist perspective and also from within the legislature. And I want to turn now to talking more about that and asking, what do you think are the forces that got the YIMBY movement off the ground and have sustained it?
So you know what? I would have given you a totally different answer just about 6 months ago, which is weird since the book was like 2.5 years old at that point. But just to share a little anecdote, I went to Kansas City for a story about renters, kind of like, I don't know what the right word is, but like activist renters groups coming together in Kansas City. Very long held thing in LA, New York, and other places. But in Kansas City, having a really cohesive tenants movement was like a new thing. And one of the things that they had there, I realize I'm not answering a question, but I promise I will, is that there was a sense that this was, I hesitate to say this if anyone here's from Kansas City, but that the lights aren't quite as bright in Kansas City as they are in other places, but they love it and it's their place. And the things they love about her, it's affordable and it's great. And I felt like even amongst kind of like the, for lack of a better term, landlord class, there was like grudging support for this movement because there was almost like a value within that place of like, well, you should be able to live here. You know what I mean? Like this isn't New York. Like, the YIMBY movement began with a lot of people in San Francisco kind of being like, I just got here and I hate that it's impossible to come here. I'm coming here for a job, or I'm coming here for sexual freedom. There's a lot of people who move there for big reasons that are central to their lives and their identity and their communities and all that. And it makes them, the fact that it's so unstable and that the city seems to relish making it unwelcoming. They sort of make a sport out of it, that pissed them off, for lack of a better term. And it felt like, independent of any policy thing, the reason I bring this up, I've really come to reflect that the YIMBY movement's like message was basically like, you don't have to apologize for just showing up here, and there should be a place for you here. Like, I don't care if you just got here yesterday, and I don't care why you got here. I want there to, you should, and I felt like the community they built was very like that value. People would disagree with different policy things or whatever, but the way they held that value and the way and how real it was, I think that is part of why it was so successful. There were all these tech people who were just demonized, but they're like 22. They're like, it's like you're from wherever and you go to like Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and then like Google offers you a job when you're 22. And then you're like, oh, I guess I'll rent an apartment. It's kind of expensive, but whatever. And then like the next day, someone's protesting you on the way to work. There's just like a lot of people who are just like, I don't know what the hell is going on here. And I think that the sort of, or there are other people who, there's a sort of a surprisingly large number of trans folks in the YIMBY movement in the meetings I went to. And you could tell they were like, I feel safer here. I want to be here. And it just bothers me that I can't get a toehold, right? So I think that the value of people sort of saying, I want to come to this place for some sort of becoming that, whether it's a wild company idea or whatever, that they all felt like there was something that they could only accomplish in the social environment of this place. And this message was like, that's okay. You shouldn't apologize for coming here. I think that's why it was so successful. I could launch into a whole thing about housing policy or whatever, but I actually don't think that's why it was successful. I think it was that there was this, I think that it was that there's this city that has taken quite a lot of pride in its welcomingness. I think it had very clearly become unwelcoming and made and backward looking, and that this was so clearly hypocritical and so clearly antithetical to the values it was professing that the next generation was calling them out, I guess you would say in the PG way, on that. And I think that's why it was so successful.
Yeah.
Yes, I wasn't sure the audience. So what is the YIMBY movement? So as everybody, or as many people know, although I'm surprised by the number of people who don't know, there is a word NIMBY, which stands for not in my backyard, and is sort of caricaturized as a person or people who are very against development in their neighborhood. We could burrow into that if we really wanted to, but, and there was this woman who is is a lively character, I would say, in my book. And her name is Sonia, and she had just moved there from Philadelphia to Oakland. And she one day decided she was just going to show up to a Board of Supervisors meeting. San Francisco is a odd city in California in that it does not have a city council. So she showed up to the Board of Supervisors and basically spoke in favor of every single project that came up. And this ranged from a 100% affordable subsidized complex to sort of like pretty high-end apartments. And she said, I am here, she made this up, from the Bay Area Renters Federation, which stands for BARF, or is shortened to BARF. And she did this, she originally called it BAR, Bay Area Association of Renters, and her roommate prevailed upon her that nobody was gonna care what BAR thought. They probably wouldn't care what BARF thought either, but it would at least get attention, and that was what she needed. So, which was accurate. So at some point she started tweeting under this moniker SF YIMBY. It's the handle now belongs to this organization, but it was actually originally her thing. And YIMBY stands for yes in my backyard. Again, in what's remarkable to me is that in 2015, late 2015, when I met Sonia, this YIMBY thing just seemed like sort of a funny thing. Not much more than her Twitter handle. People had said YIMBY in newspaper headlines and pun ways a couple. I remember there was a yes in my backyard about a city that wanted a strip club, but it was like, it was never a real thing. It was just they're playing off NIMBY. But today, this YIMBY thing has a real identity. I read stories in the Chronicle all the time about, oh, well, the YIMBYs supported this thing. And I'm like, whatever you think of the YIMBYs, I'm like, the idea that they would even be taking this thing seriously when I first wrote about her in 2016 was preposterous. You had a... Yeah. Totally. So I should say almost the entire book is about that issue. But I wanted to use characters as a way of telling it, you know. So I should say, Brooke, when you asked me why was the YIMBY movement so successful, I mean, maybe I should have been wonkier, weirdly, which is not usually a prescription I get. Basically, Sonia had become an acolyte of Ed Glazer, who is a Harvard economist who basically has spent a lot of time saying, we have a huge supply and demand problem in our housing. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons I liked Sonia so much is that I had been writing about some of Ed's reports, but they were all like, you know, economists say, you know, they weren't like super interesting stories. And then of course, this person who's, you know, driving a bright orange Crown Victoria and showing up to, you know, with glitter on it, the whole car, showing up to meetings and saying crazy things that I shouldn't repeat here, but they're in the book. That they all kind of, it was what I loved about the story, which really kind of got me started, is that it was like the Obama administration was putting out papers about this. These Harvard economists were talking about this, and here was this kind of bizarro package just spewing, economic orthodoxy. And that's why I thought it was such a fun story. I think that the YIMBY movement originally caught on and to some extent got some pushback, or remains to, because it was very wonky. It was very like supply, demand, but I actually think the reason it caught on was all the stuff I said before about like people felt like they were being punished for having, for the sin of having thought it would be like cool to live in San Francisco. And I think that is what, now obviously all the wonkery and all that, there was a righteousness to it. It was a, we're right, we have the data, we're being logical about this, you get into like a, I think all that stuff mattered, but I do think the more kind of social thing of like, this is wrong and we're being blamed for it and that's not cool. But CEQA, whatever, all the stuff is in the book, I promise you.
So Conor,
Yes.
sorry, one
I have
second.
plenty
if
of time, by the way,
Yeah,
but-
we'll stay, and there'll be lots more time for questions, I promise. So I want to ask too, so then based on your reporting about the YIMBY movement and about Sonia and how it developed as these kind of people dressing kooky and getting up at meetings and saying yes to every—
Only one dress is kooky, but yes.
Just Sonia, right? How do we get from that to then a number of bills introduced in the legislature, most of which failed in the first session, that they're beginning to introduce them. So Scott Wiener had this bill, which was roundly vilified, that would have added the possibility of building more apartment buildings. How do we get from that to then in this most recent session and leading up to now, actually the movement has seen significant wins.
Yeah.
So with the expansion of accessory dwelling units, granny flats, that people are able to build in their backyards, to the opt-in apartment bill that allows for greater density along transit corridors, to Laura Friedman's bill, which eliminates parking minimums, to ECAR's own bill, which we proposed and got passed this year, which made it so that faith communities can
yes, in
be
God's
excused,
backyard.
God's
Yes,
backyard.
yes.
And so our first bill, the YIGBY bill, which allows faith communities to build less parking if they're going to build 100% affordable housing on site. So how did we get from Sonia Trauss screaming in meetings to actually succeeding in that?
I think the answer is, okay, so the answer they would prefer, I say, is, activism came together, blah, 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 blah. I think there's a chicken and egg, and maybe it's sometimes the chicken and sometimes the egg, which isn't very satisfying. But I think, the problem got way worse. The problem, not only did it get way worse, it's housing. One of the things about housing is, and homelessness as well, is it's this problem that cannot be swept under the rug like at all. You'll read about some like pension problem and it seems like it's this big crisis. And then like the next year it's like kind of gone, except for it's not gone. It just somehow was like papered over, right? Which is bad. But my point is there are all sorts of problems in government that feel like they're very immediate and then they just kind of go away somehow, right? Housing is uniquely crazy, uniquely potent, I think, because it gets worse every year. And legislators go back to Sacramento every year with like, what are you doing about this? And they and in a way, I think this is actually one reason why I think housing and the crisis we're in, maybe the best chance we have to reform government in some pretty fundamental ways. Like there was just a story in the LA Times about how much it costs to build an affordable housing unit in LA, which is hilarious because it's still half as much as San Francisco. And it was like, 600,000 or something like that. And it was both Rick Caruso and Karen Bass sort of saying what they were going to do. And then they of course have Garcetti and they're saying like, there's nothing anybody can do. And I mean, more or less, right? I mean, but in fairness to him, he was saying, this is, the mayor cannot just do this, right? We don't live in that world. And I think all those things are true. that whatever plan you put forth, the number of reforms you'd have to make to actually implement that plan go like so far beyond one office. But I think that the fact that this thing will get worse every year and the next mayor will be faced with the same problem, it creates enough momentum that people do actually want to start reforming all those things. So I think the answer is it got way worse. It got way worse throughout the state. I mean, when Scott Wiener first started doing bills, LA's housing crisis was still pretty bad, but it had not quite reached the place of the Bay Area, probably because the tech thing in those early years just like came down hard, whereas LA was, it was happening, but it just was a couple of years behind. And now LA's housing crisis honestly feels worse than the Bay Area's, which is weird because I always think of LA as cheaper, like moderately cheaper, but cheaper. So I mean, I think it got way worse. I think it got way worse everywhere. And I think it just got to the point where there was nothing anybody wanted anybody to do other than deal with housing and homelessness, which is like the number one. And I think it also starts to affect people's lives. I mean, these people have kids and stuff. And
so ECAR is, this year, we're working on a ballot measure on the LA City ballot. And I just want to take a second to talk about that. So we're endorsing Measure ULA, United to House LA, which is a ballot measure that, of course, most of you in this room already know, is a measure that would create a new transfer tax on real estate transactions of $5 million and above. That, sorry, what was your, not a tax, a recording fee. Thank you.
what's
Stephanie,
the fee?
so I have to shout out to Stephanie Glatzky-Gamer, who's in the room with us, is the CEO of LA Family Housing and is a premier local expert.
Does all the money from that fee
affordable
go to the
housing.
person doing the recording?
No, all of the money goes to a fund that will build affordable housing in Los Angeles, with some of it set aside to help protect tenants in their homes, including providing people with legal counsel in eviction court, which of course we know is one of the best ways to help tenants keep from being evicted and fight back against potential inappropriate and illegal evictions. So, and we estimate it will raise about $800 million per year permanently to help fund affordable housing in LA. But my question for you is not, do you think it's good or bad? But what you think about measures like that being put on the ballot, what you think it says about the movement for housing in places like Los Angeles. There's a similar measure on the ballot in Santa Monica this year. I think there's other measures going on around the state. As a reporter, what do you think that says about what's happening around California and our housing crisis?
I think two things. I have my observation and then my like little dose of realism. I think that there's no way to solve this problem without profound amounts more money. And I think that more money for affordable housing and all these things have to be part of the solution. And I don't just think that because of some, predilection for taxes or whatever. You go to any city and they will tell you what they used to get from HUD versus what they get now. And it's like not, so I remember I was in Boise and the mayor was like, I started at the city in like 1980 and we got $75,000 from HUD. And he's like, I'm mayor now. And he was like, we got $75,000 from HUD this year, right? Like in dollars, right? So for community development and things like that. Boise is obviously a much smaller city, but that general trend is throughout, right? So there has been a defunding, if you will, of housing in America, and that's a problem. The thing, so more money has to be part of the problem, part of the solution, and it's not, and it's worth recognizing that this is, some of this money is just backfilling what we used to have before we had widespread homelessness. The thing that concerns me is that we have had a lot of bond measures and other things already, and they have not made visible progress. In some cases, haven't even been spent on actual housing And this is a recipe for cynicism. And I do feel like some of these measures for people to believe in them and believe that solving problems are possible. I mean, I don't even really care about the like, oh, this is the public's money and it's so important. I mean, that's important, but what I mean more is that just the spirit of cynicism that will take over if more and more money is thrown at these things, and the only thing anybody can say at the end of it is like, well, look at how much, well, it got worse less fast or something, which is literally, I had someone say that to me once. So, you know, if you're like, okay, we have $900 million a year and we solved 20% of the problem. That's not 100% of the problem, but wow, that's, you know, we can show this, we can see this here, you know what I mean? And so what I think that money is a very important part of this. We will not solve this without much more money for housing and subsidized housing, particularly homelessness, because the only way to solve homelessness is to have housing that is affordable like tomorrow, which inevitably involves a direct subsidy. But I do worry about if it continues to be that that you know, it's $1.2 million to build an affordable housing unit in San Francisco. Again, LA is not that bad. If you know, and then it takes 30 years or whatever, or you know, it takes 10, right? If that keeps happening and there aren't reforms tied to these, I feel like they will not be effective and not be and create a level of cynicism that worries me. So and the reason I'm so worried about this is that if you don't, and it's not just reforms, again, I'm not trying to say reform like because I'm some, you know, come down on the government kind of whatever, right? What I'm saying is like, if you do like HHH and independent, let's just say that was $100 billion, right? Which was a LA thing. They wouldn't have even gotten the housing built just on a timeline that would have, like, again, throw $1 trillion at it. Like if the money ceases to become important, if there's this like cinch that keeps the housing from being built, does that make sense? And that's what worries me, is that we've made it so difficult to build housing and to provide it in a way that is actually going to move with a velocity that can help solve the problem. And so I think that we need more money, but I also think we need reform so that you're actually starting, like if you spent all that money in a year, like, but the housing got built consummate with that, like that actually might do more than anyway, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think
There's some questions
there's more
out
about,
there, but
yeah,
yeah.
we're going to get to those right now. But I think just to build on what you're saying, that yes, more money, but also we need other kinds of reforms, many of which are zoning and land use reforms and reform for the different ways we fund building affordable housing. One of the reasons why it's so very expensive to build affordable housing is that affordable housing developers have to go to multiple different sources of funding and meet all of the requirements and expectations of all of those different funders, and assembling all those different pieces of the puzzle add tremendous time and cost to the process.
And just making people believe solutions are possible.
Yeah,
that's like not a small part.
So I want to I know we have lots of questions in the room. So let me start with Stephanie over here. Stephanie, go ahead. Really loud so people can hear.
Yeah. That's a whole thing. Has anybody here ever read The Power Broker? Or at least pretended to read it, which is the more, you know, I did too. That was my pandemic project. I'm convinced that and similar things in LA. It used to be quite easy to build
Robert
things.
Moses.
Yes,
You should,
yes. And now Rafe Fiennes is doing his Robert. Have you seen that? Yes. Anyway, Robert Moses was the quote unquote master builder of New York. He was never elected, but essentially could build. It's crazy to read this book because they're like, oh, and then you just built that bridge and no one could stop him. You're like, how does that work? Like, you know, you're like, don't you have to go to the committee for the committee for the committee, you know? And I'm convinced that all this was a response to Robert Moses had all these acolytes in every city, and there are scenes of this book where people are going and visit, how do you do this? And then, you know, in San Francisco was a guy named Justin Herman. I don't know who the redevelopment person was in LA. The point is, it used to be quite easy to build things, and perhaps too easy. Yes. But there was this big backlash with freeways, with redevelopment, whatever, and now it's impossible. And I'm convinced that, like, at one point we were at like one place where it was like you just steamroll a neighborhood, and then we got to a place where you can't do anything. We're like trying to find some place.
I want to get to Doris, had a hand up a while ago.
You are. So here's what I can say about this. You will get a rah-rah every time you say that. You will either get it's just like, I don't know what to do about this, because it is often described as the third rail of California politics, and it kind of is. And I just don't know. I mean, there's a website, I forget what it's called, but there's a website where you can type in people's addresses. My dad referred to it as elder abuse, but that gives you a sense of what side of the thing he's on. But they have a $10 million house in Palo Alto, very wealthy community in Northern California, and they pay lower property taxes than a $400,000 like ramshackle whatever. I mean, that's an extreme example, but it's you know, I don't know what to tell you other than the origins of Prop 13 were right here in the city of Los Angeles. Many of your homeowners associations, in particular Sherman Oaks, were very involved, at least in the organizing and passing it. They remain very active today, although I know a member of the Sherman Oaks Homeowners Association, and even though we disagree on everything, she is very lovely. So they're all, anyway, this is all a very long way of saying Prop 13 can consume every single policy discussion you will be in this state for the rest of time. And I don't know what to say about it other than it's like this thing we got to just like live with. That's the only conclusion.
A different answer, which is to say this, that actually we worked on a proposition that failed 2 years ago now, Prop 15 it was called, which was the Schools and Communities First initiative that was designed to split the role. So to undo Prop 13 for commercial real estate.
I covered that one.
It failed, but we're not alone. You're not alone, nor are we alone in thinking that Prop 13 reform is much needed. And I think there certainly will be other initiatives coming forward to try to do that, probably piece by piece, because it is very difficult to undo it altogether.
No, and I don't mean to be cynical. I'm just saying you start, I don't know what to say, but I will say the Schools and Communities First was a really interesting one. As you may or may not know, just to make your head explode a little bit more than it's already exploded, this does not just apply to homeowners. So the Walt Disney Corporation pays hardly, yes, okay. No, but she, you know, it's incumbents, period. Yes, that's, no, but no, because even if you bought it 10 years ago, let me tell you, as a guy who bought a home, like you start to notice pretty quick. I'm now a max payer, but just because I bought a house in July, but even in Oakland, I could see it after 5 years. So
Tony.
So this is where, yeah, no. So I'm going to voice an unpopular opinion here, which is that, so I've, as you can tell, I was sort of tortured about this whole thing during the book. And I didn't know how to deal with it. And I guess what I would say is that there's a different political question than there is economic question, you know? I don't think new housing causes gentrification. A lot of people believe it does. I don't. I think there can be, some people believe that it can be a signaling device and it can start to steamroll on itself, right? But developer who goes and builds, you know, a nice new building in a less well-resourced neighborhood, there is not an instance I can find where the developer is responding to low rents. They're always responding to, wow, look what kind of rents they're getting for like kind of crappy places in that neighborhood. Let's go build a bunch there, right? And so in theory, I'm not saying it will happen tomorrow or the next day, right? This is net positive for bringing rents down. Okay. Not a lot of people can believe that. And not a lot of people are gonna get on board with any kind of political message with that, right? And so how you respond to those concerns are more like how you respond to quote unquote NIMBYism than they are not. And that just saying that angers people. How can you compare me to NIMBYs? Well, you know, but politically, it's, I don't see the difference as being, you know, other than how you think about it or how you emote it. I don't see it as being that much different. So how you respond to it politically is different than what I think the economic solution is. And there are all sorts of instances in public policy over many, many, many years, decades, where everyone said one thing would happen, and then, you know, somebody did something, or, you know, there was right? And like, not that thing happened, right? So I think that now, waffling a bit more, you know, we do have something like a right to occupancy in this country. People do believe that people who are in a place and kind of have gotten settled there have some respect is owed to them, right? And people do that in wealthy neighborhoods. They also do it, you know, and now they're starting to do it in poorer neighborhoods with gentrification. And I think that thing, you know, like we generally respect that the people who are there have some sort of say, right? I don't think that's on the whole bad, as long as you pass some sort of plan that applies somewhat equally. Does that make sense? Anyway, what I'm saying is that I don't know what to say about this. Because the stock answer, the stock political answer to the question you just gave me is, well, we should only build 100% affordable and blah, 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 right? But the thing is, people fight those buildings too, right? Like there's the answer is, let's build nothing but affordable housing in the, you know, along Mulholland Drive next to $30 million, whatever, right? You know, but that doesn't, I don't know if that really works out either, because that's like the homes that are built there are built kind of low density, somewhat by design. The roads there would, you know what I mean? There are things. And so I guess what I'm saying is that gentrification is a huge issue, but I do believe at some level it is being driven by a lack of housing options, and that creating more housing options at a range of price points, some heavily subsidized, some market rate, is at some level going to be the solution. Now, I try not to get into, especially as a newcomer, and also just like litigating exactly what neighborhood, exactly what parcel. That's like one of the places where local control is actually really helpful. And I actually think that the state's general strategy, I'm sure that there's all sorts of things that the state does that are distant and, you know, impositional, but their basic strategy is like, we're going to give you a number based on sort of your job and economic activity and things that we think new housing requires, right? You can meet that number however you want. And, you know, but And your local knowledge is better than our knowledge at meeting that number. But if you don't meet it, we're going to start taking the land use power away from you as this whole builder's remedy thing, you know. And so I actually think that tussle is good. I think that, you know, it's not going to be some clean, easy process, right? But I do think this whole thing of like, here's a number, you figure it out, and you guys figure it out amongst yourselves. I think that's a good strategy. Again, I'm sure that there will be things that come up, but that like idea, you actually do have local knowledge. But I mean, the crazy thing too, at some level, and this, I know this much better in the Bay Area, but it must also be true in LA, is that these people complain about local control, but they build office buildings like crazy. You know, like it's not like anybody's anti-growth. Like Palo Alto built all these tech office buildings, you know, and then they're like, oh, well, we don't want growth. And it's like, it's funny, they always talk about being Manhattanized, but Manhattan has about 2.5 jobs per housing unit. Now, this is a place that has like, I mean, many people I'm sure have been there, but you know, multiple bridges, multiple subway lines, freeways in, the whole place is set up for the daytime population to be significantly larger than the nighttime population. And it has about it's a little over 2 jobs per housing unit. Obviously that's a 2018 figure, but, or, you know, a pre-pandemic figure, right? Palo Alto had like 4. So, and it was crazy. You would be trying to leave that place and it would be like if you left at the wrong time, you would truly just be stuck in like one of those traffic jams where you're like, is this like a natural disaster? Anyway, my point is that we have been on purpose, that, by the way, this is a Prop 13 thing, unbalancing the jobs housing units. We have been Manhattanizing ourselves for fear of Manhattanizing ourselves. We've been creating a place, you know, that should have a high, you know, we've been creating neighborhoods that have high daytime populations, but then there's nowhere for anyone to go at night. And I think so that like, the thing is that we actually have planned this whole thing. And I think that at some level, until you balance that equation a little bit more, each of these like little hot pockets, gentrification fight, traffic fight, whatever, are all just symptoms of that sort of grand problem we've created, if that makes sense.
So there's so much more I know that we could talk
Yes.
about. And also I'm aware that it's 2
I don't hear my
o'clock.
son crying, although I know
And
you
your
guys
son
have
is here
your
and
own,
probably would be very happy to get
no,
his daddy back.
I mean, well,
So I
he hasn't
think
hit
the
anyone
polite
yet.
thing for us to do now is to wrap up and let you go.
Mhm.
But I just want to thank you again,
No
Conor,
problem.
for spending the time with us. It's been really informative. I really urge everyone to go and read the book if you haven't had a chance. It's called Golden Gates. And then come join us. We are doing work for housing justice. We will continue to be doing work both in this election and afterward. We've got a phone bank coming up on Tuesday night. We'd love your help calling members of our community to get them to support Measure ULA and other measures that we're supporting. If you're still wondering about how to vote, we did a Know Your Ballot event just earlier this week with LA Times journalist Julia Wick. We posted that on our website along with a spreadsheet of endorsements. So you can look at not only the ballot measures we've endorsed, but endorsements from lots of other organizations to get some help figuring out who to vote for, which ballot measures to vote for, some information about how to research judges. It's a very confusing ballot we have in California. And so we all need a little help figuring it out.
We should
But
do a whole seminar on dialysis.
let's learn. Let's do dialysis. Let's go. But just thank you so much, Conor. We appreciate it, and we're glad.
Thank you.
Welcome to
Thank
our
you.
community.